The ballroom glowed as if it had been gilded by false benevolence, every chandelier blazing with 1,000 cut crystals that scattered light like indulgent lies. Silk skirts whispered across the polished floor, jewels winked at one another with conspiratorial brilliance, and the air itself seemed perfumed with expectation. Yet beneath the splendor ran a quieter current, sharp as a blade and just as merciless. It traveled by way of glances, murmurs, and the delicate tilt of fans, and it carried a single name from mouth to mouth with practiced cruelty. Miss Eleanor Ashcombe. She stood near the edge of the room, precisely where she had been placed by custom and by choice, her posture immaculate, her expression schooled into composure. The pale blue of her gown was modest beside the riot of color around her, chosen not for admiration but for restraint. A woman with less discipline might have fidgeted, might have searched the crowd for rescue or recognition. Eleanor did neither. She kept her gaze forward, her gloved hands folded, and endured. It had not always been this way. Only months earlier, her presence had been greeted with polite interest, even cautious approval. She had been considered suitable, never dazzling, never coveted, but acceptable. And in a society governed by calculations of fortune and blood, acceptability was often enough. Tonight, however, something had shifted. Tonight, Eleanor Ashcombe was no longer a possibility. She was an embarrassment. The cause of that transformation moved effortlessly through the crowd, laughter trailing him like music. Mr. Julian Harrowmont was everything the room admired, tall, composed, and born with the ease of a man long accustomed to deference. His dark coat fit him precisely, his bearing was impeccable, and his expression carried that faint reserve so admired in gentlemen of his station. On his arm rested a young woman in ivory satin, her smile radiant, her fortune unquestioned. She was a bride he was meant to want. Their arrival had drawn the inevitable pause, that subtle collective intake of breath that marked the entrance of consequence. Eyes followed them, approving, appraising, satisfied. This was how things ought to look. This was order restored. Somewhere near the refreshments, Eleanor heard a voice, low and careless, remark that it was a mercy she had never truly been considered. Another replied that such women were always mistaken about their prospects. The word struck, but she did not flinch. The narrator of history might have called it a small cruelty, scarcely worth noting amid the grand rituals of the evening. Yet such moments were the ones that reshaped lives. Eleanor felt the weight of them settle upon her shoulders, familiar and heavy. She had known disappointment before. What stung now was not surprise, but the manner of it, the public certainty with which her exclusion was accepted. Music swelled, and couples took their places. Julian guided his companion toward the center of the floor, his hand firm at her waist. He did not look toward Eleanor, not at first, and she told herself that was proper, that indifference was kinder than acknowledgement. She told herself many things. Still, when the dancers began to turn, when laughter rose and skirts fled, something compelled her to lift her eyes. She saw him then, framed by candlelight and motion, his profile sharp with restraint. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, as if drawn by an impulse he could not wholly command, Julian Harrowmont looked beyond his partner, beyond the admiring circle, and found Eleanor where she stood. The world did not stop. The music did not falter. Yet in that instant, the distance between them felt charged, narrowed by something dangerous and unspoken. His gaze lingered, not long enough to be named impropriety, but too long to be dismissed as chance. It held recognition, and something like regret. Eleanor felt it land upon her with unexpected force. Heat rose beneath her composure, not from hope, but from the sharp humiliation of being seen only now, when she had already been discarded. She lowered her eyes, mastering the instinct to retreat. If he looked again, she would not be there to receive it. Around her, the ball continued in splendid indifference. Glasses chimed, compliments were exchanged, and futures were bartered with smiles. Eleanor remained still, an island of quiet amid the tide. Yet within her, something shifted, subtle, irreversible. Shame, long endured, hardened into resolve. And across the room, Julian Heromont danced on, unaware that a single glance had begun a reckoning neither of them could yet name. Morning arrived in Eleanor Ashcombe's small sitting room with a grey patience that suited her mood, light filtering through lace curtains and settling upon familiar furniture like a benediction long withheld. She had just finished arranging her gloves when a discreet knock sounded at the door, neither hurried nor hesitant. The maid entered carrying a narrow parcel wrapped in brown paper, unadorned save for a single wax seal pressed with a mark Eleanor recognized at once. Her breath caught, traitorous and sharp. She waited until she was alone before breaking the seal. Inside lay a slim volume of poetry, its leather binding softened by age, a ribbon marking a page already worn by touch. No card accompanied it. None was required. Eleanor's fingers hovered, then traced the embossed spine with reverent care. Julian Heromont's mother had once owned such a book. Eleanor had admired it in passing, foolishly, and spoken of a particular poem that had lingered with her since girlhood. That he remembered felt at once intimate and perilous. She closed the book, pulse unsteady. Gratitude warred with caution. A gift, however innocent in intent, could not remain so in the hands of society. It would be seen, discussed, distorted. Eleanor placed it carefully into her desk, as though hiding a spark that might yet set her world alight. By afternoon, the air beyond her windows hummed with rumor. She encountered it first at her aunt's table, where conversation paused too long upon her entrance. A raised brow, a half-smile, the faint suggestion that Mr. Heromont had been most attentive of late. Eleanor responded with practiced civility, offering nothing that might be seized and shaped into accusation. Yet she felt the gaze of others sharpen, curiosity pricked by the faint scent of impropriety. Julian, for his part, did nothing to dispel it. At a luncheon 2 days later, when a remark was made regarding Eleanor's supposed ambition, his voice cut through the polite clatter with calm authority. He did not raise it. He did not smile. He merely observed that such speculation revealed more about the speaker's inclinations than the lady's character. The table fell silent, startled by the rebuke. Eleanor met his eyes only briefly, but in that moment she understood the risk he had taken. Risk, once noticed, invites escalation. The following morning, as rain threaded silver lines through the street, Eleanor found Julian's carriage waiting outside her aunt's residence. The invitation was spoken softly, framed as necessity rather than indulgence, a matter requiring discretion. She hesitated only long enough to consider the consequences, then stepped inside, heart thrumming beneath her cloak. The carriage moved through the city like a secret, wheels hissing against wet stone. They did not touch. They did not speak of feelings. Julian spoke instead of obligations, of arrangements made and unmade, of the peculiar tyranny of expectation. Eleanor listened, offering measured responses, aware of the intimacy such conversation implied. When the carriage stopped, he helped her down with careful distance, yet his hand lingered a fraction longer than required. It was enough. They were seen. The whisper followed her home, outran her, greeted her at the threshold. By evening, speculation had grown teeth. Why had she accepted? What had she promised? Eleanor bore it with outward composure, but alone she pressed her palms to her eyes, willing the ache away. Dignity, she reminded herself, was not maintained by retreat alone. That night, another message arrived, this time unmistakably private. Julian requested her presence the following evening at his residence, where matters might be spoken plainly. Eleanor read the note twice, then folded it with deliberate care. The invitation trembled between salvation and ruin. Accepting would mark her irrevocably. Refusing would leave everything unsaid. She stood at her window long after the candle burned low, the city breathing beneath her. Somewhere, reputations were being weighed like coins, futures bargained over cups of tea. Eleanor felt the ground shift beneath her certainty. The gift hidden in her desk seemed to pulse with unspent meaning. Tomorrow, she knew, would demand an answer she could no longer postpone. Eleanor arrived at Heromont House beneath a sky the color of burnished steel, dust pressing close as if intent on eavesdropping. The footman ushered her through hushed corridors into a library warmed by firelight and shadow, where tall shelves rose like sentinels guarding accumulated thought. Julian stood near the hearth, one hand braced on the mantel, his posture betraying an unease no society gathering had ever coaxed from him. When he turned, relief crossed his features before restraint reclaimed its place. For a moment neither spoke. The crackle of the fire filled the silence, punctuated by the distant tick of a clock marking time with merciless regularity. Eleanor removed her gloves with deliberate care, as though each finger freed were an act of resolve. She sensed that whatever passed between them this evening would not be reclaimed or revised. "I am grateful you came," Julian said at last, his voice measured but low. "I feared it might be too great a presumption." "You have already presumed much," Eleanor replied, not unkindly. She met his gaze, steady despite the quickened beat of her heart. "I would prefer honesty to caution now." He inclined his head, acknowledging both the rebuke and the invitation. "Then I shall endeavor to be worthy of your presence." He gestured toward a chair, but she remained standing, unwilling to accept comfort she had not earned. Julian drew a breath, as if steadying himself against an internal tide. "I have been accused," he began, "of encouraging rumor, of offering you attentions that invite misinterpretation. Those accusations are not without merit." He paused, searching her face. "Yet they fall short of the truth." Eleanor felt the words settle, heavy with implication. "Truth," she said softly, "is rarely kind to women in my position." "That is precisely why I must speak," he replied, stepping closer before stopping, mindful of the narrow line propriety demanded. "I did not choose you when I ought to have considered you. I told myself it was prudence. That affection was a luxury unsuited to my responsibilities. But in truth, it was fear." Her breath caught, though she did not look away. "Fear of what?" "Of what you awaken," he said simply. "Of being seen without the armor I have spent a lifetime polishing. You were never the bride I was permitted to want, Eleanor. Yet you have been the one my conscience cannot release." The admission struck with quiet force. Eleanor felt something within her shift, not into hope, but into clarity sharpened by pain. "I will not be a consolation," she said, "nor a rebellion undertaken for your own relief." He flinched, then nodded. "Nor should you be. I would not ask it." His hands clenched at his sides. "I ask only that you believe I have wronged you not through indifference, but through weakness." Weakness. The word hung between them, startling in its vulnerability. Eleanor turned away, pacing a few steps as she gathered herself. The fire warmed her back, but her thoughts were cold with memory, of glances withheld, of judgments endured. "You speak of conscience," she said. "Mine has learned caution. Careless regard has consequences I alone am asked to bear." "I know," Julian said, anguish threading his composure. "And it is that injustice which shames me most." She faced him again, emotion carefully reined. "I have feelings I did not seek," she confessed, the word costing her more than she had imagined. "But I will not surrender my dignity to indulge them." "You shall not," he said, fervent now. "I swear it." He took one step closer, then stopped, as if bound by invisible chains. Their proximity charged the air, awareness humming between restraint and desire. His hand lifted, then fell. "If I touch you now," he murmured, "I fear I would not stop." The honesty of it left her breathless. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to the space between them, to the soft glow of firelight tracing his profile, to the ache of what might be. Eleanor felt the pull, undeniable and dangerous. She closed her eyes, mastering herself. A sudden knock shattered the moment. The sound was polite, inevitable, intruding upon intimacy like judgment at the door. Eleanor opened her eyes to find Julian's expression altered, resolve hardening where uncertainty had been. Whatever path lay ahead, it would no longer be navigated in shadows. The reckoning arrived not with raised voices, but with the brittle politeness of a drawing room assembled for judgment. Eleanor felt it the moment she crossed the threshold of Lady Fernwick's afternoon reception, where conversation faltered and eyes turned with too much interest. The air was thick with civility sharpened into scrutiny. Reputations were not shattered loudly. They were dissolved with smiles and carefully chosen phrases. Julian stood across the room, unmistakable even amid the gathering, his presence commanding a space others instinctively ceded. He looked toward Eleanor without hesitation, and in that look was no apology, no retreat. It was an acknowledgement, open and irrevocable. She inclined her head in return, pulse steadying as resolve replaced uncertainty. Whatever had been whispered, whatever conclusions had been drawn, this moment would not be endured in silence. The hostess did not delay. With a sweetness too practiced to be sincere, she steered conversation toward propriety, toward expectations unmet and obligations ignored. Eleanor listened, her hands folded, her posture impeccable. When a pointed remark surfaced, one questioning whether certain attentions had been misinterpreted, Julian moved. He crossed the room with unhurried precision, every step deliberate. The murmurs stilled as he stopped beside Eleanor, not touching her, yet unmistakably aligned. "If there is confusion," he said, voice calm but carrying, "the fault is mine. I would prefer it be addressed plainly rather than embroidered with conjecture." The silence that followed was dense, expectant. Lady Fernwick offered a brittle laugh, suggesting discretion might better serve all parties. Julian did not return the smile. "Discretion," he replied, "has too often been used to shelter unkindness. I will not allow it to do so now." Eleanor felt the weight of the moment settle upon her shoulders, but it did not bow them. She sensed, dimly, the shock rippling outward, the careful recalculations taking place in every mind present. Julian continued, his gaze sweeping the room before returning to Eleanor. "My regard for Miss Ashcombe is neither casual nor clandestine. If that unsettles you, I regret the discomfort, but not the truth." A collective breath seemed to release at once, some in astonishment, others in thinly veiled disapproval. Eleanor's name, spoken with such clarity, felt reclaimed. She turned to Julian then, meeting his eyes fully. In that exchange lay question and answer both. "You need not defend me," she said quietly, though her voice carried its own authority. "I'm capable of standing my ground." "I know," he answered, just as softly. "That is precisely why I stand beside you." The declaration was not followed by applause or approval. Instead came consequences, swift and unadorned. A relative approached Julian, face drawn tight with concern, speaking of inheritance, of obligations imperiled by impulsive sentiment. Others withdrew, their smiles cooling. Eleanor observed it all, aware that each withdrawal marked a door closing. Yet she felt no urge to follow them. Later, as the gathering dissolved into fractured politeness, Eleanor found herself alone with Julian near the tall windows overlooking the garden. The light had softened, dusk pressing its gentle acclaims upon the day. "You have placed yourself at odds with many," she said. "Perhaps irreparably." He exhaled, a sound both weary and free. "I have spent too long aligning myself with expectations that left me hollow. If this cost me comfort, so be it." She studied him, seeing not the assured figure of society's approval, but a man choosing consequence over convenience. "And if it costs me more than whispers," she asked, "if my name is never quite restored?" "Then I shall endeavor," he said, earnest and unguarded, "to ensure you never regret the cost." Eleanor considered the promise, weighing it against experience. Then, slowly, she nodded. "I choose you," she said, "not as a refuge, but as a partner. On those terms only." A faint smile touched his mouth, reverent rather than triumphant. "I would not have it otherwise." They parted that evening under no illusions. The path ahead was uncertain, strewn with obstacles neither could yet fully name. Yet as Eleanor stepped into the waiting carriage, she felt a shift settle within her. Not the giddy assurance of fairy tales, but the steadier strength of choice freely made. Across the darkened square, Julian watched until she was gone, aware that in claiming her openly, he had set into motion forces that would soon demand a final reckoning neither love nor courage alone could forestall. Months passed, not with the mercy of forgetting, but with the stained deliberation of consequence. Winter surrendered to a cautious spring, and with it came the quiet accounting of what Julian Harrowmont had forfeited. His uncle's approval cooled into formality, then silence. Certain invitations ceased altogether. A portion of the inheritance, once assumed immutable, was quietly redirected. None of it surprised him. What surprised him was the lightness that accompanied the loss, as though shedding expectation had freed him to breathe. Eleanor felt the change more subtly, but no less profoundly. Society did not forgive her. It merely grew accustomed to her presence anew, as one might to a scar that no longer provoked comment. Some doors remained closed. Others opened with hesitation. She learned to move through drawing rooms with a steadier step, her chin lifted not in defiance, but assurance. She was no longer waiting to be chosen. She had chosen. They met now without secrecy, though rarely with indulgence. Walks were taken in public gardens, conversations shared beneath the open sky, their hands never touching longer than propriety allowed. Yet in those restrained moments lived a depth neither had anticipated. Julian listened to Eleanor as though her words shaped him. Eleanor observed Julian with an affection sharpened by respect. Love, she discovered, could be quiet and still fierce. The final reckoning arrived on an unremarkable afternoon, summoned by a letter bearing his family seal. Julian read it once, then again, before folding it carefully. Eleanor watched from across the room, her expression composed. She did not ask what it contained. She had learned the value of waiting. "I am to choose," Julian said at last, "to sever this attachment and regain what was withheld, or to accept permanent estrangement." Eleanor nodded, absorbing the words without flinching. "And you?" "I have already chosen," he replied, though his voice bore the weight of finality. "But the choice demands witness." They traveled together to the country estate where his family had long presided, its stone facade unyielding as memory. The meeting was brief, precise, stripped of sentiment. Julian spoke plainly, naming Eleanor without apology. The response was equally plain. Affection was dismissed as indulgence. Eleanor was not unkindly disparaged. She was simply deemed insufficient. Eleanor stood silent through it all, her presence both catalyst and proof. When Julian refused to recant, the matter was settled. They departed with nothing reclaimed, yet something intact. The journey home was quiet. As dusk settled, Eleanor finally spoke. "You need not have brought me." "I needed to," he answered, "so that nothing might be decided without truth standing present." She regarded him then, seeing the cost etched into his composure. "You have given much." "So have you," he said. "More than I deserved." They returned not to grandeur, but to a modest home arranged with intention rather than inheritance. There, without audience or announcement, they began again. Julian took on work once considered beneath him, discovering purpose in labor honestly earned. Eleanor found her voice in smaller circles, her insight sought, her dignity unmistakable. Together, they shaped a life unremarkable to history, yet profound in its constancy. On an evening warmed by firelight, Eleanor sat with a book open in her lap, the familiar poetry now softened by years of meaning. Julian watched her from across the room, struck anew by the quiet strength she carried. He crossed to her, kneeling so that their eyes met without ceremony. "I once believed," he said, "that I required a bride to complete my life. I was wrong. I required courage, and you taught me that love is not ornament, but necessity." Eleanor closed the book, emotion brightening her gaze. "And you taught me," she replied, "that dignity is not diminished by devotion freely given." They clasped hands then, ungloved, unafraid. Outside, the world continued in all its noise and judgment, unaware of the quiet triumph unfolding within. History would not mark their names with flourish. No grand ball would commemorate their union. Yet in the measured rhythm of shared days, in the firelight and the steadiness of choice renewed each morning, they found an ending truer than any society might bestow, and a beginning neither had dared hope to claim.